Hello everybody and welcome along to a brand new video today where it's the return of the classic Doctor Who reviews as I'm tackling one of the very early Patrick Troughton stories, the next story I've reached in my marathon. It's The Underwater Menace. So yes, this is the third Patrick Troughton serial as playing the second Doctor, back airing in 1967. Yes, it's The Underwater Menace. We've only got 2 episodes remaining now, unfortunately, after they were obviously all junked many years ago, but 2 of them have been recovered and therefore there's been a DVD release of sorts. And so that was how I watched it, with episodes 1 and 4 being some fairly terrible reconstructions, and episodes 2 and 3 being existing at the moment in the archive. So that was enjoyable to be able to actually see this. And of course, this is the earliest, well, episode 2 of this story is the earliest existing episode of the Patrick Troughton era. The Patrick Troughton Doctor, as the first 11 episodes of his run are completely gone. There's a few very short snippets, but pretty much that's it. And this is the first proper look we get to see at sort of Patrick Troughton's character as the Doctor in his sort of very early. He's still trying to sort of figure out the character and how to play it. And so it's a very kind of interesting insight on that side of things, I certainly think, and is quite enjoyable to watch, at least in his performance regard. Because yes, The Underwater Menace is absolutely crazy. I think it's fair to say. It's just, I think the barmy is a good word that they use a lot sort of in the DVD documentary and things to describe it. It's just absolutely mental, all over the place, trying to do something a little bit different with Doctor Who, I guess, from obviously a one-off writer. This guy never wrote another episode of Doctor Who after this, and I think you can kind of understand why if you've seen the story, because it is yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting idea in terms of the sort of Doctor and companions accidentally stumbling upon Atlantis, the lost city of Atlantis underwater. And there's some mad scientist who's taken it over and is supposedly going to be bringing Atlantis back up to the surface and sort of reappearing as a city, but instead is actually going to blow up the whole world because he's a mad, crazy scientist. And it does feel like one of the sort of early mad scientist plot lines. I don't feel like we had many of those in the William Hartnell era, so it's kind of, in some ways, nice to get that sort of mad scientist sort of story early on in the Patrick Troughton era. Though it's certainly fair to say that Dr. Zaroff is completely mental in this story. His character is ridiculously over the top. He's a classic sort of foreign mad scientist villain who is just completely bonkers. Makes for a fun and entertaining story in terms of the amount that he is just kind of overplaying this character. He's absolutely playing it up to 100 really, in terms of how sort of off the charts kind of, it's almost not really camp, but just kind of really over the top in his performance. And it's actually quite, you know, in a way kind of fun to watch. He's got the look of it as well, the kind of crazy scientist hair, and the sort of moustache as well, and just the whole kind of look and vibe that he gives off is very much of this crazy mad scientist character, and for me it is actually quite sort of entertaining to watch almost, I think. Of course, as I say, this is one of these stories that is very much got so many kind of different things thrown at it. Obviously we've got the whole Atlantis and sort of being underwater and everything, and the mad scientist. You've also got the kind of tribe in this, and tribal worship and sacrifice and gods, and the sort of superstitious element of it as well. There's a bit of kind of conspiracy between the different ones. Obviously the conspiracy of the mad scientist who's actually trying to blow up the whole of Atlantis rather than save them, which they don't know about. And it's just got so many kind of different facets to it. It's kind of like this writer's just kind of chucked every single idea he's got in his brain into this story and tried to sort of arrange them into some sort of order to make some sort of story. And in places it works, in places it really doesn't work. It's very all over the place in that regard, but it does make for kind of, I think, a story that keeps you reasonably engaged, because it does just kind of keep changing what it wants to be. Of course, you've got the fish people in this story who are kind of they're not villains, they're not even aliens really, they're kind of modified humans operated on humans. I mean, I was a little bit surprised, I have to say, watching this story for the first time, having seen them sort of emblazoned on the box of the DVD, that they only actually get 5 or 6 minutes of screen time. I was kind of, I guess, expecting a little bit more than that in that regard, but obviously I mean, they're only really needed for a fairly small purpose in terms of they are kind of slave workers rather than a big alien threat or anything like that. It's just they're quite visually striking. Even if the costume isn't spectacular, it's certainly those kind of main ones do still have quite a kind of, yeah, visually striking, unusual looking sort of costume to it. And some of those scenes when they're meant to be underwater and kind of swimming around and everything does look really quite impressive. You can, on one of the shots, and it's just about see a wire, but other than that, given the budget and the sort of age of it being filmed in 1967, or no, 66 probably. It really does look quite impressive, and I was kind of surprised in that regard. Even if overall they didn't get much screen time, in terms of that sort of single scene, it did look quite impressive. And of course, this is the first story where Jamie's introduced as a companion. We meet him in the Highlanders, the previous story, and then he's sort of brought on board the TARDIS team for this story. And I think you can see that this story probably wasn't originally written with 3 companions in mind, given that it's kind of, the dialogue is very kind of spread out across the 3, and it feels like they don't all have that much to do. I think the underserved sort of companion of this story is definitely Polly. She kind of, it seems like the writer didn't actually know what her character was, because she's not, it's kind of, she's a reasonably kind of strong woman, I think, in her previous story. She's very much the one who's kind of leading them all into danger, kind of fighting against the villains and everything like that. And then she spends 4 episodes of this story just screaming and being scared about everything, but scared about being in the dark and stuff. Like, this guy clearly didn't watch Doctor Who particularly, and didn't know anything about Polly's character, because it does feel like a complete sort of mischaracterization of her character almost, I think, in terms of, for this particular story. I mean, I'm hoping that once we get onto the next one, the Moon Base, which I've never seen before either, that she'll be back to her more normal character. But yes, it does seem very, very weird, the way that she's written in this story. And she also has basically nothing to do at all in this story. She really doesn't serve anything to do with the plot, apart from getting sort of nearly operated on by, nearly becoming a fish person. Instead, she just loses all her character, basically. So yes, that's another kind of a fairly significant fault of the story, shall we say. Though I have to say that I do think Patrick Troughton is absolutely fantastic in this episode. I think he's really kind of, he's still kind of figuring out the role, even sort of 3 stories in. He's still kind of just trying to understand exactly how he wants to play this character. And then I think, as it's described in the making of documentary by Robert Sherman, who wrote Dalek, of course, he kind of explains how in episode 2 or episode 3 of this story, it's where Patrick Troughton really kind of finds his character completely. He's put opposite Zaros this crazy, absolutely over-the-top performance of a mad scientist, and Patrick Troughton realises that he can't kind of top the level of craziness that Zaros is going as. That instead he's going to have to go the other way and sort of underplay the part in that sense, and kind of be the more sort of quiet, caring, scheming, solving all the problems kind of Doctor, instead of being an over-the-top Doctor. And I think that's where he sort of develops into the character that we see later down the line in some of his later stories, like Tomb of the Cybermen, War Games. Some of his sort of latter stories, I feel like this is almost the start of his character becoming more like that. And so it's just, yes, it's really, really, really kind of interesting to be able to see the earliest existing footage or sort of proper stories of Patrick Troughton, and just to see his character sort of in its earlier phases and how it develops. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the rest of its sort of overall development as I continue through in this sort of Classic Who marathon. One of the things I have to say about, well, watching the DVD, I want to comment on the DVD briefly, because the telesnap reconstructions are pretty woefully bad, it has to be said. If you compare them to the loose cannon reconstructions, which are the ones I've been watching for pretty much all the other stories that have been missing up until this point, the DVD version absolutely pales in comparison. Like, just simple things like a little bit of narration on screen telling you what's happening when there's no footage and there's just noise. Like, it's not any dialogue, so you don't know what's going on. The pictures doesn't show it, and yet you just have no idea what's going on in those moments. And so it's just little things like that. It very much looks like they were only able to purely stick to the telesnaps. They're like, we've only got 25 telesnaps, we've got to make it spread over 25 minutes of an episode and just lay them in order to match up to the audio somewhat. And so that was a little bit of a challenging watch, shall we say, sort of struggling, particularly in episode 1 I found, because obviously I hadn't watched any of the story yet, so I didn't know what was going on. So it was quite difficult to kind of get into it in the first episode, just because the kind of reconstruction of it was so poor. Though one of the things I also wanted to comment on was the kind of fairly wacky music in this story. Of course, it's a Dudley Simpson classic. I didn't realise initially, but then obviously saw in the credits that it was composed by Dudley, and I was like, oh yes, of course. How could it be anybody else? And it's just kind of, I sort of felt that style of music, and it almost feels like something out of the Tom Baker era or something, or certainly something out of the kind of late John Pertwee, early Tom Baker kind of time. It just, that sort of music almost brought it forward to that era, I felt like, because that sort of style of music, that sort of really bizarre electronic sounding music, kind of almost feels synonymous with the kind of Pertwee / Tom Baker era of Doctor Who. And so to kind of hear it in the early Troughton stuff almost sounds a bit sort of strange, and yeah, just kind of made it feel like this story wouldn't be out of place sort of later on, sort of based off the music and the feel that the music gives it. I mean, some of it, the music seems a little bit out of place. I know obviously the challenges of trying to kind of, you're having to record the music beforehand and slot it in and hope it's the right length, which is really rather challenging. But yes, just in place it sounds a little bit weird in terms of the sort of placement of the music, but yeah, the music itself is just bizarre and a bit brilliant, really. And so overall, this story is a bit crazy. The mad scientist is a very, 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 very mad scientist. It's probably not one of the best episodes of Doctor Who you've ever seen, but it was a bit of fun, and it was kind of a little bit different, I guess, to a lot of what you get in Doctor Who, and so I don't think it's kind of terrible. Obviously, there are sort of shortfalls in this story and things that do let it down, but I think overall it's a story that you can kind of enjoy from time to time, but it's definitely not one of the greatest stories ever. But what about you guys? What do you think about this story? Have you seen it? Apologies if I spoiled it all for you because you haven't seen it. But if you have, do let me know what you thought of this story down in the comments below. I'd love to hear if you've got any sort of different opinions to me, any thoughts just on sort of the early Troughton sort of period of Doctor Who, what you think of Troughton as the Doctor in these kind of early stories, and just any other thoughts you've got around it. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. But other than that, just remember to hit this like button, subscribe if you're new here, and I'll be back very, very soon with another video. Goodbye!